Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. In fact, the task to introduce the theme for today's discussion is really, onerous because, just in few minutes, I have to flag some of the issues which will be discussed throughout the day. But still, in fact, I will try to simply look at some of the important issues which are related to this theme, that is the rise of right-wing nationalism in the era of globalization. In fact, when this idea came up for discussion, that what should be the theme for day-long seminar, this issue, this idea, or this theme appealed to everyone because these two aspects are becoming inescapable in our social, political, and economic life today, both globalization as well as right-wing nationalism. And particularly the way, in fact, this right-wing nationalism is showing its, face in different parts of the world and in different forms. In fact, on the one hand, what we find that in Western Hemisphere, this entire issue of right-wing nationalism is emerging on sense of deprivation. And that's why this entire protectionist measures and other things are being, talked about, promoted, be it United States of America or other European countries. But on the other hand, the same right-wing nationalism, in spite of many similarities on issue of majoritarianism, minority bashing, on immigration issue, a number of things, we also find some differences happening in other parts of the world, including India. Because when Modi talks of his nationalism, his brand of nationalism, he is not basically using or trumpeting this issue of deprivation in era of globalization. He has started basically, giving this impression that the time of India has come. It is a sense of arrival on this historical moment. Particularly when he talks about 3 Ds: democracy, demand, and demographic, dividends. In fact, he is trying to give this impression that this century belongs to Asia, and in Asia, particularly India. So you have different type of discourses today, in circulation so far as this right-wing nationalism is concerned, in spite of some similarities and some convergences. But one thing we should remember, that this entire issue of globalization, because entire issue today we are supposed to discuss here, that how this right-wing nationalism is to be understood within the broader framework of globalization. Because globalization is just one aspect of the rise and growth of capitalism. And as we know that after the emergence of modern period, a number of things and processes happened, and 2 of them perhaps deserve special mention here. One is the rise of modern nation state with the Treaty of Westphalia, and at the same time this transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe. But as we know that these 2 things, therefore, the rise of nation state and nationalism, to say, to put it rather more simply, and capitalism have shared a historical bond over the years. But nonetheless, the articulation of the 2 have happened through number of trajectories and number of processes in spite of this historical bond. For example, the way we have seen capitalism undergoing major changes, and particularly in this phase of globalization, capitalism has altogether acquired a different dimension. In fact, globalization is also a historic process. As this concept note which is in circulation would tell you that how we have tried to look at this process before 1750s and after 1750s. That how earlier it used to be 2-way process and how gradually it got transformed into 1-way, particularly in this contemporary phase of globalization, particularly after the advent of this entire market orthodoxy or marketization of capitalism. So therefore, these are the issues we have to keep in mind, that how the capitalism has been changing over the years, particularly over this historical period. But at the same time, we should also not lose sight of this fact that nationalism is also not a very monolithic concept. Nationalism has also undergone different changes. For example, I remember in 1980s, there was one book authored by Ernesto Laclau, Politics and Ideology. And he made a very perceptive observation that how nationalism has got articulated, has had number of articulations due to the class alliances. The same nationalism in some of the erstwhile socialist countries, because of its articulation with the proletarian interest, acquired a different form and became a left nationalism. Whereas its articulation with a different type of class forces in some of the European countries became fascism and Nazism. So therefore, he tried to look at this, autonomous character of nationalism and its articulation with multiple, class, positions in the society. So what we are basically up to today, that nationalism, therefore, is also like capitalism, is appearing to us in different forms, from the left to right to extreme. If fascism and Nazism can be characterized as the extreme form of nationalism, we also have the left nationalism, particularly after this transformation of the entire discourse of socialism in one country, started with Stalin, Soviet Union, and gradually it spread to different parts of the world. Some of the Latin American countries, including Brazil, Nicaragua, and China, can be cited as an example of left nationalism, where basically the entire argument of entire discourse of internationalism was abandoned in favor of socialism in one country, and also glorification of the nation state. Similarly, you also find that this right-wing nationalism, which is also a product of a particular historical epoch. And this is something we have to see in relation to this process of globalization, that how globalization has basically propped up this entire discourse, how it is providing important important elements in this discourse, be it the question of deprivation. Globalization, as you know, that those countries, particularly those ideologues who are trumpeting this entire globalization as perhaps the most liberating moment in human history, the same ideologues have started berating it, be it Stiglitz or for that matter anyone, when they say that only two countries have been the beneficiary of this process of globalization, China and India. And therefore, this is something, a very, kind of ironical situation, that from, the epicenter of capitalism and globalization, we are hearing the voices of dissent, so far as the globalization is concerned. And therefore, accordingly, the number of policy prescriptions are being suggested, including protectionism, closure of markets, and closure of boundaries, into entire issue of immigration, and perhaps Brexit issue is the best example of this entire thing. Now, it is in this context we have to see that what are the challenges before us today. Because if both are inescapable, globalization and right-wing nationalism, what are the challenges before it? And the most important challenge perhaps we face is in terms of liberal democratic values, that how long this liberal democratic discourse will be able to withstand this pressure, particularly in terms of the larger issues of majoritarianism which it poses. And it is here, in fact, I would like to mention here that this entire issue of majoritarianism is not something which was not thought of, which was not imagined. It was imagined from the very outset, at least in political theory and political philosophy. It was always believed that nationalism has an inherent tendency to become majoritarianism. And it was also fondly believed that this majoritarianism of nationalism will be checkmated through democracy, and democracy will become the antidote of this majoritarian character of nationalism. But interestingly, it was also at the same time, prophesied that democracy also has a tendency to become majoritarian. And if both democracy and nationalism become majoritarian, then what would be the antidote? And it is perhaps in this context that we have seen the entire churning in political theory on the issue of constitutionalism and constitutional values. That constitutionalism will checkmate the majoritarianism of democracy, and democracy will checkmate the majoritarianism of nationalism. But interestingly, what is happening in some parts of the world, including India today, we are witnessing, all three of them are turning majoritarian. Nationalism is already has a tendency to become majoritarian. Democracy is, of course, also possesses a lot of elements to turn majoritarian. But interestingly, the constitutionalism, which is to act as a kind of bulwark against this majoritarianism, is itself turning majoritarian today. And we could see this process happening in not a place which is far off from this place, Jawaharlal Nehru University, a few years ago. when this nationalist majoritarianism and democratic majoritarianism were sought to be checkmated through constitutional means, and all three of them plundered. So this is happening all around the world, and particularly this is something a very ominous sign so far as this entire democracy and and democratic values are concerned. With these words, I would like to stop here, and there are many more issues which will come up. The entire program has been split into a number of sessions. We'll be starting the first session with a discussion of historical and sociological dimension, and also the political economic dimension associated with this process. Then we'll be moving to more political and more informed debate from the point of view of political economy. And then finally, in the third session, we'll be looking at the scientific technological dimension of globalization, because as it is normally seen that this entire revolution in communication revolution, the information technology, they have basically propped up this process. And finally, in the last session, we'll be taking a more comprehensive account of this process. With these words, I'll stop here.